Almost all the maps in Michigan owe their start point here. All the townships, all the property lines, all the counties, they all start at 2 points right here. Well, actually 0.5 miles that way. We're at the Meridian Baseline State Park to explore an interesting story about the history of this state. One that is unique in the United States, as Michigan has 2 initial points. No other state has that. I'm Chuck, the channel's Restless Viking. Let's have an adventure in knowledge. Begin at the beginning, said the king to Alice and Alice in Wonderland, but our story ends here. Well, actually it begins here and ends here, because in surveying you have to survey sometime backwards to get to your start, or you have to start at someone else's endpoint. Don't worry, stay with me, it'll all make sense. This is a pretty interesting story. It all started on July 4th of 1776. The US declared independence and the Brits said no. But after a costly war, the Brits gave up, and then on September 3rd of 1783 they said, okay, you guys are independent. Here's all the land over there in North America that we have control of. So with that out of the way, the fledgling government of the United States was poor. They owed a lot of money and they didn't have a lot of prospects for income. But what they did have is millions of acres west of the Appalachian Mountains. And if they could convince the current owners, the First Nations, to cede the land to them, then they can go out and subdivide it and sell it and make money. So they told Thomas Jefferson, you're in charge of figuring out how to subdivide the land, and then we'll go and speak to the current owners and see if we can't work out a bargain deal. So Thomas Jefferson came back with an idea, and the Land Ordinance of 1785 was in existence. It outlined how land would be divided and split, and it even had provisions for the future. If the landowner wanted to split the land further and sell parcels, they could, using a system called the Public Land Survey System. It's a pretty straightforward system that divides land up properly for private ownership. It's the basis for private ownership, for a road system, for pretty much all the mapping that we do. And to fully understand this story, we have to understand how the PLSS works. It all starts by hiring a contract surveyor who goes into the territory and establishes a pretty much random initial point. From that point, they establish a meridian and a baseline. The meridian will go north and south, and the baseline will go east and west. From those lines, all surveying would start. From there, they would survey 6 mile by 6 mile blocks and call them townships. Then they would further subdivide that township, ideally into 36 1 mile by 1 mile sections called sections. The sections are part of a township. The townships eventually become counties, and then the counties eventually would become a state. Each section, being a mile by a mile, is 640 acres. Each quarter of that section, a quarter section, would be 160 acres. The size of land that they were giving to veterans who served 5 years, I believe in the War of 1812, as payment. And if you bought that piece of land, you could easily identify it as the northwest quarter of section 16 of Cannon Township in the county of Kent. With this system in place, and with government officials already planning how to subdivide Michigan, the Treaty of Detroit was signed, ceding most of southeast Michigan to the US government. At this point, the survey of the Michigan territory could begin. In April of 1815, the US government surveyor general of the Northwest Territory, a man named Edward Tiffin, hired a surveyor named Alexander Holmes to establish the Michigan baseline, and I quote, due west from a point above Detroit. Holmes hired his brother Samuel, and they made plans to survey the east-west line, or the baseline, and then start subdividing townships and sections from there. So the Holmes brothers were going to take care of the baseline, the east-west line, but there was still a matter of the north-south line, the meridian. And Tiffin, a couple days later, hired a man named Benjamin Huff to, and I quote, lay out a true meridian from Fort Defiance. Fort Defiance was already a known point in the survey of Ohio. So the Holmes brothers and Huff met at Fort Defiance in September of 1815. They decided to locate their initial point 78 miles north of Fort Defiance. They would survey 78 miles through thick wilderness, swamps, bogs, rivers, crossing rivers, until they reached a random point in the middle of Michigan. Once they reached their point 78 miles north of Fort Defiance, Ohio, they would set their initial point and then begin surveying. On October 9th, before they reached the meridian, they decided that Huff would leave the survey and start surveying land to the east, while the Holmes brothers continued north to the initial point. In mid-October, Holmes, just 7 miles south of his destination, reached this, the flooded Portage River. It's not even flood season. It's the autumn of an average rainfall year, and the Portage River's flooded, and it's been canaled, and a lot of the land's been drained. but it's still wet around here, so he probably ran into something pretty bad. He couldn't get his survey equipment across, so instead he headed east, surveying the secondary baseline, intending to reach Lake St. Clair, eventually getting to the initial point later. He would backtrack. By early November, the frost had established itself. The thin ice came. They broke through the ice as they trudged through the wilderness. They waded through icy water, and it was just too difficult to continue. So they suspended the survey for a while. Then in early 1816, Huff returned to the survey work that the brothers did. He essentially backtracked to the survey west instead of following the true meridian north. He finally made it to the initial point, and he marked it. This is the initial point. So Michigan's mark was finally established. The basis for all mapping in Michigan was going to start here. Well, east of this mark it was, because the story's not over with yet. With all those troubles and hardships, the wet land, the swollen rivers, the difficult swamps, the Holmes brothers and Huff reported back saying, you know, the Michigan territory is not really suitable for farming. It's not suitable for settlement. Maybe 1 in 10 acres. We don't recommend that you consider this land. There might be something better somewhere else. So effectively, surveying in Michigan stopped. But then 8 years later, the government obtained lands to the west of the meridian, so surveying could start up again. Enter Joseph Wambler. He was hired to go back up the meridian to the initial point established by Huff and then survey the land to the west. But he didn't start in Fort Defiance. Instead, he started here in a quiet neighborhood in Jackson, Michigan. Jackson wasn't established then. That would be less than a decade later. What was in the area, though, was an intersection of trails established by the indigenous population. So from here, he found the wooden stake. He went 12 miles north to find the initial point. But when Wambler reached the Portage River, it wasn't flooded. He surveyed across, and when he got to the other side, he immediately discovered that the marks that the Holmes brothers and Huff laid weren't accurate. And when he surveyed to the initial point, it wasn't there. He discovered that the initial point was 935.88 feet south of where Huff had marked it. It seems that all the hardship and backtracking that Holmes and Huff did had some errors in it. So the initial point wasn't where Wambler thought it should be. But actually that's okay, because an initial point is a random point in the new territory where you start everything from. It doesn't have to be exactly 78 miles north. It can be anywhere. But that's apparently not what Wambler thought, because for reasons that are a mystery to history, he decided to start his survey here, 935.88 feet south of the initial point Huff established. And then he surveyed to the west. So today, to the keen observer of maps of Michigan, you'll notice that there's a difference between those initial points. The borders don't match up north of the Portage River, but they do match south of the Portage River because they were both taking the same path and nobody backtracked. Michigan is the only state in the union that has the distinction of having 2 natural points. So if you're ever west of Detroit, near a point just above Detroit, you can stop by the Meridian Baseline State Park. It has an interesting and trying history as well. It took a long time to acquire the land for us to walk back here and find these 2 points. The park's been here for a while, but there was no public access because it was landlocked. They were even going to locate the Michigan Surveyors Museum here, but it's in Lansing now. But if you get a chance, stop out. We got about 1.5 miles of hiking trails. We got 2 large monuments to look at, and you can ponder the reason why Wambler decided to start it back there, even though it didn't matter. I guess some people are perfectionists. But one thing to contemplate is the heroic efforts that surveyors put into Michigan. We don't talk a lot about the surveyors that covered every square mile of this place before it was a place, when it was still a wilderness. So I tip my hat to the surveyors of Michigan. They did some amazing work. My name's Chuck, I'm the Viking. Channel's Restless Viking. From Meridian Baseline State Park, until our next adventure.